That's showing okay.
Yep, shows good.
Okay. Hopefully the speaker will be there soon and you can hear me well. Again, I'm sorry cannot be there. I really wish I was there and I didn't have to deal with this injury. Again, it's just learn that I'm not 20 years old anymore, doing things I shouldn't be doing, and I end up with a broken shoulder. But one thing that it's improving, so it's getting better. Yesterday I started with physical therapy, so that's not fun either, but I guess it's part of the process. So hopefully you'll be back there soon. And so, okay, so just a kind of overview how we were thinking this will go this morning. I'd like to touch a little bit on primarily on phosphorus, but also a little bit of update on sulfur and talk a little bit on pH as well. And then Sandra has some discussion on soil sampling, and Lucas Heck should be there fairly soon, also talking primarily about nitrogen. Like Sandra mentioned, one of the things that we have the publication that was recently updated. I think she has some copies there. There are some, most of the changes there are really more on nitrogen. So I think Lucas will discuss that a little bit more. But the plan is really to update this pretty regularly. And so we do have other changes coming for phosphorus in particular. There have been some small changes there, but more bigger changes, I guess, for phosphorus will be coming soon as well. A lot of it based on the research that I'm showing today and data that we've been collecting the last few years. Okay, so one thing also I like to do, and I don't know if Sandra is there close or not, but I'll like to, I really obviously prefer to be in person there. The discussion, conversation about some of this is really the best part. But that's not, pretty easy, obviously, with the via Zoom. And so what I like to do is to pause every so often, Sandra, and just make sure there's some questions there, and that way try to have some of that discussion going on as well. And again, don't hesitate to stop, ask questions. Again, Sandra, or I hear Luke is also there. Just raise your hand and just stop me anytime, okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Okay, so like I say, we'll talk a little bit about phosphorus main crops here. We have several studies that we pretty much completed at this point on corn, soybean, and wheat, crop response, and different soil test methods. Quite a bit of stuff on new soil test methods. Some new methods that has been kind of came up in recent years. Others that commercial labs are using more frequently, and so we like to look at those more closely and include that in the recommendation. So all of those are things that we are changing. And again, we'll talk a little bit about sulfur, corn and wheat, which is again kind of becoming a bigger issue. And just touch a little bit on pH, depending on how we're doing with time. Okay, so one of the things I guess just wanted to kind of put in perspective is basically where the nutrients go, right? And if we think about phosphorus, a lot of the phosphorus tends to be basically removed in the grain. Very little stays in the residue. That's different for other nutrients like potassium, kind of similar to nitrogen, and a little bit like sulfur as well. But again, the key point here is that you can mine phosphorus quite significantly over time if you have good yields, right? Because again, a lot of that goes into the grain. Very little stays in the residue. And so this is important to keep in mind for phosphorus in particular. Sometimes we get this question that, if we are, removing the residue, corn residue from the field, how much phosphorus we are removing. And typically, phosphorus is not a lot. Now, yes, we can take up obviously quite a bit of nitrogen, potassium, but phosphorus not much because there's not a lot of phosphorus in the residue, okay? So that's something to keep in mind. We'll kind of keep this in mind. Also, I always like to show these values, and these are in the fertilizer recommendation publications. The removal of P2O5 per bushel of grain that we are harvesting. Okay, so one of the things that often question that we often got is what about the phosphorus fractions in the soil, and we know that there's a lot of phosphorus in the soil that is not available to the plant, right? So if we're looking at total phosphorus, it's not uncommon that you're going to see something like 300, 350 part per million total soil phosphorus, but that's not plant available, right? So what we measure in the soil test, like MELIC, is what will be considered to be plant available, and those are obviously low values, right? 20, 30 part per million. So anyways, one of the questions is how much of that really, that large pool of mineral phosphorus become available. And this is one way to put a number to this, I guess, to give you an idea. This is a study from Tribune, 63 years without any phosphorus application, background levels of soil test MELIC, typically about 2 part per million. And that's when you're getting 2 part per million soil test MELIC, that's basically essentially zero. That's background levels. Okay, so that's basically as close as you get, pretty much. And you're putting those treatments, 40 or 80 pounds of P2O5, irrigated corn there in Tribune, Western Kansas, pretty good yields, right? Over 200 bushel, no phosphorus, basically half of that, right? But still producing. And so again, that's what's interesting. And so if you look at the removal, how much phosphorus coming from that zero, we see that it's about 35 pounds of P2O5. So where is that coming from, right? And so that's a question, right? We're not putting any fertilizer, and that's basically an indication of how much of that mineral pool is becoming available and providing some phosphorus for that corn. And so that's one way to look at that. Now, the dynamics is quite different because when you're not putting any phosphorus and you have very low, basically zero MELIC phosphorus, there are other things that start to help there, right? We have mycorrhiza, things like that become more active and start kind of helping that crop a little bit more, right? And so that's one thing to keep in mind there. So dynamics are a little bit different. The other thing too is that this is really not what we want essentially for crop production, right? Because we're basically cutting in half the yields, by being sure of not putting that phosphorus. So anyways, just wanted to put that a little bit in perspective that there's some of that pool of mineral phosphorus that becomes available. And the reason why I think it's important to talk about this is because oftentimes we talk about different soil test methods to kind of measure that, and in reality, that's it's a small amount that becomes available, but it's really for agronomic purpose and in the context of trying to maximize yields, it really is contributing, but it's very small part. Okay, so this is one of the studies that we are finishing actually last year. I think we still may have a couple sites this year. This is a total of 30 locations for corn. One thing I just want to highlight here, some of these fields actually probably from some of you there in the audience. I don't know. Sandra is always very active in working with us and helping to put some of these studies. And we do have, out of these 30 sites, we have 5 locations that are in Smith County and Jewell County. Okay, so again, very relevant for you guys in terms of what you may be seeing here in terms of results. Okay, so what do we see so far across all of these locations? Yield response to fertilizer, different rates of phosphorus here, all the way to 120 pounds. Everything's basically broadcast, apply pre-plant. Okay, most of the time, usually early spring, and depending on the tillage system, I think we have a few locations that were conventional tillage; those were incorporated. Otherwise, basically, no till stay on the surface. Okay, so what do we see yield-wise? Pretty much you maximize yield when you get to about 60 to 90 pounds of P2O5, right? 30 pounds, not enough. And this is your check here, basically. And again, this is across all locations. We have a mix of everything there, pretty decent yields, actually. some irrigated. Obviously, some of the ones there in Smith and Jewell counties, all dry land. Okay, so one of the key questions with this is what is the critical value of soil test MELIC 3 that we need to be keeping for corn, okay? And these are the locations, these are just different regression lines. And you see about concentration that we get here is about 22 parts per million. And this is using the colorimetric MELIC 3, okay? And this is important because, again, we'll talk a little bit more about different soil test methods, and this is something that I think we need to emphasize more and more, because different labs tends to use different analysis methods, and interpretation obviously will be different. And so I think that's, again, I keep emphasizing that we need to pay close attention to that. Nothing wrong with using different methods as long as we are interpreting the results using the correct values, okay? And so kind of the standard, the most common one is the MELIC 3 colorimetric. That's what most people tend to use. But for example, just to give you an idea, one that many commercial labs use more regularly is also the ICP MELIC 3, which is still MELIC 3, but just different way of reading the concentration. Okay, any comments, questions there?
What was the pH on those soils where you're doing these tests at? Are the most of them in the 6s?
Excellent question. Wide range of pH values there. We do have most of them in that range of 6 to 7, but we do have a few calcareous soils, high pH, close to 7.5 to 8. And I will show you that a little bit here in a minute. And that's a very good question, because depending on the soil test method that we use, that can make a big difference. Good question.
So what difference do you see? Like if you're testing one, you had like 30 fields tested. Does the critical value stay the same if the soils are testing, say, average of 7.4 compared to their testing average of 6.4?
Yes, that's a very good question, and the answer to that is really the challenge there is really the type of soil test method that we are using. The problem there is, so the short answer is probably is no, really. But the problem there is that we have some soil test method like Bray that doesn't work very well in high pH soils, okay? And so those values, when you look at Bray, tends to be much lower. But ultimately, what's really important here is that what is this soil test value means in terms of relative yield. And so here's where I think we need to keep an eye on this. A lot of times the value may be different from different soil test methods, but how well are those predicting relative yield, especially in those high pH soils? And so I think that's a key point there. In other words, okay, let's say, for example, Bray is showing up to be much lower in high pH soils. But the question is that still doing a good job in terms of predictive yield response, yes or no? And that's, to me, that's more important. And typically what happens is, like, for example, Bray will not do a good job in high pH soils. It's basically not predicting the response very well. So we need to switch to something like Olsen, or MELIC also do a good job, okay? And so, yes, to your question, initial question is, yes, those numbers can be affected in high pH soils. But ultimately, is that still predicting yields, yes or no? That's to me the key point. And so, yes, we went and looked at multiple really different variety of soils for that reason, and kind of to see how these different methods are performing. Good question. Any other comments, questions?
What was the soil test on that in the Tribune one that had the 62 years? One of them you said was 2 or 3, the one that had no phosphorus. What about the rest of the fields that had these higher rates on them? What was the soil test level P MELIC 3 on those fields that were showing that response?
Yes, and I didn't include the actual number. That's a good question too. I didn't include the actual number, but if I recall, let's go back to this. One of them is 40 pounds of P2O5. And this is actually slightly below removal. So the value on this, if I recall, was in the single digits, still about 10 part per million. And don't quote me on this. I need to really check the number, but it is below removal, so it's just below, a little bit short of what we should be putting. Now the 80 pounds of P2O5 is above removal, so with this we actually kind of building up soil test a little bit higher. Okay, and so. So anyways, I guess one of the things that I got this comment before is that, there's not a huge difference here between 40 and 80. These are statistically significant. And one of the things that I think we need to emphasize here is that with the 40, we are not putting enough basically to keep that soil test above 20 part per million. Where essentially what we're doing is that sufficiency, right? We're putting a little bit less than what's really needed. And obviously trying to maximize that yield. Okay. Well, we're not maximizing, but maximizing will be obviously in this case average 210 bushel. But I'm sorry, I don't have the actual number. But again, I just want a way to answer is that the removal here, in this case we are below removal. In this case we are above removal, basically for long term. Good questions. Other comments? Okay, well, just keep going. Thank you. I guess you guys can hear a little bit. I'm glad. I'm a little concerned that with the computer speakers not getting there. But okay, so we have this response, right, to soil test, relative yield, and again, I showed this before. Putting things in terms of economics, what that really means, right? And we kind of break even similarly around that 20 part per million. Below that, any phosphorus application we're doing, we're gonna get a significant response to investment that particular year. If we have soil test values that are really in that 30 to 40 part per million, which in many cases, many of you may be keeping soil test P in that range, which is fine. In that case, what we're doing is that we basically have the opportunity to, skip phosphorus a few years if we want to. And I know that happened a lot, when the fertilizer price was pretty high a couple of years ago. Some guys have the opportunity to say, okay, I'm sitting at 35 part per million. I'm gonna maybe cut back a little bit this year because of the high price, which is great, right? And so that's really just a management decision in this case. It's not really losing money in this case. I mean, this is in the year of application. But what happens is basically we're not getting that money back that year. It's really a little bit more of a long-term management. Okay. The other things I wanted that we are doing with this set of trials and that same set of 30 sites that we have the last 2-3 years is to look at tissue testing. How well is tissue testing maybe work for phosphorus? And in the case of tissue tests, one of the challenges, of course, is that it's a diagnostic tool that is very helpful, but in the case of phosphorus, there's typically not much you can do that year, right? And so you take your tissue analysis, come back low in phosphorus. What else are you gonna do that year? Probably not much, right? But the way I see it is another diagnostic tool that you can use in combination with soil tests, to corroborate and make sure they are really in good shape, because soil test is not perfect either, right? And the same way for tissue analysis. And so, in my opinion, looking at multiple sources of information always helpful. And there's a lot more tissue analysis going on in easier, cheaper. So a lot more people doing it. And so we use that data. In this case, is relative yield. Okay. And so essentially, in this case, what we've seen is that when B6 tissue concentration is below 0.4%, we basically start to see a yield penalty. Okay. And so essentially the same way that we are analyzing this for phosphorus. For soils. Again, we have a critical value in this case of about 0.4%. Ear leaves, R1, similar kind of situation. Obviously, the actual value is different. So a couple of things I want to highlight here. First of all, that you're doing the typical V6 tissue testing or ear leaf tissue testing. It can tell you something about phosphorus and the potential response to fertilizer. One thing that is different about this research that I want to highlight compared to what you get in the report from maybe soil testing labs is that soil testing labs give you basically that range of what's optimum for tissue concentration. That's basically based on survey, right? Just the same way that we go to the doctor and we got the analysis there and says you are everything looks okay, or you are in the red or whatever, right? So you give you that range based compared to the normal population. So they take obviously analyze thousands of samples and say, okay, in average, this is where most of the samples come. So it's considered normal. In this case, what we did is really related to response to fertilizer. So that could be a little bit different, because what we're saying here is if it's dropping below 0.4%, you're going to see a yield penalty. There's potential there to see a response to fertilizer. So that's maybe a slightly different interpretation, okay? And so that's one thing. The other thing I want to emphasize here is that, look at the critical value that we see for V6. It come back to 0.4%. In the case of ear leaf, came back to 0.2%. And so these are another thing that I always like to emphasize is that, the optimum tissue concentration of nutrients in plants change over the growing season, okay? And oftentimes what happens is that, as the corn or soybean or wheat gets bigger, the concentration of nutrient, concentration tends to be lower. You have some of that dilution going. Bigger plants, and again, that concentration tends to be lower. Obviously, the overall content of nutrient is higher because you have bigger plants, but the concentration is lower. And so again, very important to keep in mind what's the growth stage, okay? Is a V6 or is a V10, is a R1? What's the growth stage when you are sending those samples for analysis? And this is more of that data. One of the things that we wanted to do in this case, obviously, is what kind of response you may see when you have low tissue concentration. And you get into about 0.2% concentration, and you can see, more than 50% yield increase, okay? And so you're getting pretty high tissue concentration, apply fertilizer, you don't really see anything, okay? So it's a lot of noise here, okay? These actual data, obviously from many fields, a lot of noise, but I give you that trend is there, right? The other thing too is how many pounds of P2O5 you need to apply basically to achieve that response. And these are another, again, also pretty noisy data, but again, it is field data, so that's the way it is. And again, you're getting pretty low in tissue concentration. You need, at minimum, sometimes in that range of, 70, in some cases up to 100 pounds of P2O5 to maximize that yield rate. Okay. So the same way also, we can develop the same type of recommendations we have for soil tests. We can develop for tissue and say, okay, if your tissue concentration is 0.2%, you need to apply so many pounds of P2O5. In this case, it's going to be for the next crop, right? And that's one of the challenges with tissue analysis, of course. So I have to recognize that. Comments, questions so far?
Don't be bashful.
Okay. Soybeans. Again, also ongoing research on soybeans. One of the things that we see in this case, all of this is the same method that we're using, mailing-free, okay? Critical value came back in this case lower, 17 part per million. So very clearly soybean, basically critical concentration tends to be lower than what we see in corn. One thing I want to highlight here, look at these pH values here. Completely out of whack here in terms of where those numbers fall, because we have those very low pH. And essentially what we are seeing in this case is that you're pretty much aligning with phosphorus. which is something that can happen. And actually, you know, we done that quite a bit. South Central Kansas, we do a lot of that for winter wheat. You know, if you have low pH, what do? You put some infrared phosphorus with it. And that kind of take care of the aluminum toxicity problem, right? So essentially, you're liming with phosphorus. And so that's exactly the same thing that you see here that show up. And this is not, we didn't do this on purpose, but it's kind of nice to see that, you know, some of these, when you have other issues like pH completely out of range, can affect other nutrients like phosphorus and what kind of response you see there. And so the key message, I think, in this case is that, hey, always take care of that pH if you can before you go to other nutrients, okay? It is a bigger investment. It is tends to be a challenge sometimes, long-term decisions, but again, it has implications for other nutrients, especially things like phosphorus. Comments or questions on this? Okay, 17 part per million critical value. We did the same thing with tissue testing for soybeans. The kind of the critical timings that we're using here is V4 for trifoliates early in the season. And then the trifoliates R2 pot setting. Okay, a lot more noise. It's not as nice as what you see for corn. And there's something there you can tell, but you know, when you're getting below, in this case, 0.3%, you start to see significant drops in yield here. And you see some of that as well here. There's a lot more noise. Okay, and again, all this field data. Some of these were, and probably have to clean some of these as well, because, you know, we have some of these, I think, included some data from last year with the drought and everything. It's been just pretty strange data in some cases. Okay. So the other component that we're doing here with this study, and this is part of this set of 30 sites that we did for corn, selected locations we are following up the following soybean, and basically see what kind of response are we seeing in the following soybean to the rates that we apply to the corn. And the question is, do we need to apply more phosphorus? And this is soybeans, okay? Soybean yield response basically to direct application of phosphorus. So different rates of phosphorus here. You can see, you know, all the way from 0 to 90 pounds of P2O5, yield response, and this average of 6 locations so far from the last couple of years. Pretty good response all the way to, pretty much all the way to 90 pounds of P2O5 in those low testing soils. And these are responsive low testing soils, okay? So again, spring apply ahead of soybeans, and again, response there. Now, what happened, the treatments that we apply already before corn, and so these are all the same locations. And if you start to compare, you know, the 30, 60, 90, and we actually added another 120 here that was applied before the corn, okay? And so just to see if we have, that makes a difference, putting that extra for both corn and soybeans. You can kind of see this, how these two set compare here. A few things that to me really shows, you know, this is 30 pounds applied before corn. It's not the same as 30 pounds, you know, applied right before that soybean. So essentially, you know, you apply 30 pounds before corn, don't expect that much of that phosphorus it's gonna be there for the following soybean, right? Soybean really suffer in this case, you know, just about the same as 0, okay? And so basically nothing left from that corn. You get to about, you know, 60, 90, things looks much better. Definitely at 90, you know, if you're putting 90 pounds ahead of corn in low testing soils, I mean, that's pretty comparable to about 60 in the 60, or even the 90 in the case of soybeans next year, okay? So again, that's basically plenty there for the 2 crops. And obviously, if you are putting 120 pounds ahead of corn, that's definitely enough for the 2 crops. And what's the average of corn for corn here? I think, and I showed that earlier, in that range of 180 to 200 bushel. Okay, so think about that in terms of removal. That also, that's removing somewhere around, close to about 60 pounds of P2O5. So anyways, I think it's this, I mean, and this is not uncommon, and I always like this approach of, if you have the opportunity to apply enough phosphorus for maybe a couple crops, and that makes sense economically from the application standpoint, I always like that. I think it's a good practice, because unless we are losing that phosphorus somehow, which is not an issue, right? And so, but the key point here is that, make sure and know how much you are removing with the two crops, and be careful not to be too short. Again, in this case, I mean, if you're putting only 30, there's pretty much nothing left there for the soybean next year. Comments, questions on this?
Well, so I'm having a hard time hearing you, partly because I can't hear, but so when we're talking about applied feed, what's the difference whether you're broadcasting it or putting it 2 inches below the seed or beside the seed, and what application in these studies was used?
Okay, so help me, Sandra, there a little bit here. The question is about placement, right? And how that may be impacting. Is that correct?
Yes, it's about placement.
Yes, in long term, as we're finding out, in long term no-till, gratification is becoming somewhat of an issue. And especially if we put it on the surface, I'm told we're going to entire no-till operation. But in this study that you're in, this data that you're getting, what kind of, where are you placing the feed?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's a very good question. And this I'll show here a slide later in terms of placement, and that's really important for phosphorus. All of these are all our broadcasts in the case of no-till on the surface. Okay. But in this case, we are not really looking at things necessarily long term. And that Tribune data, for example, that's broadcast as well, but that's incorporated. It's conventional tillage. But in no-till, obviously, we're not able to do that. There are other opportunities here. We definitely need to be thinking about how to place that phosphorus. And if we are doing the strip till, obviously that is not no-brainer. Obviously, we're putting there the fertility with the strip till. But there are also other opportunities, with starter fertilizers. There are some people that put in phosphorus with the drill, with the earth seeder, injecting that phosphorus, a couple inches at least. And so those are all options. The question of stratification, is that really a problem agronomically? And, a lot of data shows that not necessarily. In no-till systems, over and over again, we see that, the roots are accessing that phosphorus. However, we do have other problems in the long term. Obviously that phosphorus there is higher risk of losing, right? And if we're losing that phosphorus, that's gone, right? We're not taking advantage of that in the long term. So thinking a little bit more on the long term, that's where I think some of these maybe have a bigger impact. But agronomically, for the most part of that broadcast in no-till, the crop is taking advantage of that. And again, those are all the advantage of no-till, right? We have that residue cover, roots are active near the surface, things that we are not seeing in conventional tillage. So all of those are the advantage there. But I like the question from the long-term standpoint. What's happening to that phosphorus if we have really high hot concentration in the upper inch or even in the upper half inch? The risk of losing that is pretty high. I agree with that. And so that's another factor here. So anyways, maybe I'm not giving a good answer here, but I guess looking a little bit more from the short-term agronomic, shorter-term, I guess, agronomic, and assuming we are not losing phosphorus, the broadcast on the surface in no-till is effective.
Good question. Your earlier ones, test about by Colby was a 20-inch area. If you're doing some around Manhattan, it's more of a 30-inch area. How fast does that phosphorus actually move? You was always told it didn't move very fast.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Actually, I do have a slide for you here. Let me show you that later here because I did something about that for winter wheat and we'll discuss that. So let's wait for that because I do have some data on that. I'll show you here in a minute. Okay, so another study that we just finished and this on winter wheat, and again pretty heavy on Western Kansas. Again, a lot of stuff there where your neck of the wood there. Sandra always pretty active working with you guys and getting some stuff there in Smith County and the district in general. So we have some of this data from you guys, and then pretty heavy in Western Kansas. And so again, variety of soils and soil test level and pH and try to capture that a little bit. Winter wheat is it's just really responsive to phosphorus, right? From the crops that we grow, winter wheat for sure is going to be the one that tends to show the most response to phosphorus. So always keep that in mind. It's really nice to see the visual differences. Sometimes, in corn, you don't tend to see some visual differences. May show up in yields, but not visual. But when you see something like that, graduate students get pretty excited and we get to see nice responses. So anyways, so these are average of the 24 locations that we have. Yield response, we really kind of maximize yield response to about 80 pounds of P2O5 in those low testing soils. And again, these are all responsive low testing soils. Obviously removal, and this related to yield as well. We can, this may be a little bit there and bump over 120, over 80, but really for the most part, 80 is what we need to maximize yield. Put a little bit more in perspective here the different soil test methods, okay? And so this is, again, similar to what I show you for corn and soybean. This is your typical relative yield here. This is a soil test method here. You see, your regression. In this case, what I included here is really the different methods that we are evaluating. Kind of the standard, the default is a MELIC3 colorimetric, and that really for winter wheat came back about 25 parts per million. So this is going to be the next, and I was hoping to include this change already, this revision of the soil test recommendation, but we couldn't make it with the data. Some of this data is still kind of finishing up, but for sure, we need to increase critical value recommendations for winter wheat. We basically need higher soil test level. Right now, we are using 20 parts per million for MELIC3 colorimetric. That's not enough for winter wheat. We need 25. That's for MELIC3 colorimetric. One thing that I wanted to put in perspective here, and to kind of thinking about a little bit on the other kind of discussion and question early on, what about other soil test methods and pH and so on? One of the things I want to emphasize here is that look at the other methods. You have Olsen, is the critical value is different. You have MELIC3 ICP. Look at this, 36 parts per million. Okay, and so this doesn't mean that these these methods are wrong or it's right or anything like that. It means that the scale of these soil test methods are different. Okay, and so this is important for interpretation because one question, one comment often is that the MELIC3, you have MELIC3, but just if you are analyzing by colorimetric or if you are analyzing ICP, the number is quite different. And this is important. We have sometimes conversations. Some of you may be part of programs with NRCS, for example, and we obviously we have to stick to certain guidelines for soil test recommendations, and sometimes the lab recommendation is in ICP MELIC3, and the recommendations is in colorimetric. And so again, we just need to be thinking this. Keep in mind, it's different methods are gonna give you a different scale. Okay, that's the message here. And some methods are better for some soils. Western Kansas high pH soils, Olsen is really the way to go. That's really the best option there. MELIC3 is also good, okay? But then other methods like Bray, not so good. Okay, and so this is already something that we just quickly kind of overview. You know, the reason why Bray it tends to be an issue in some of our soils is because really this was developed in Illinois. And when actually I did my master's at the University of Illinois, and I was there in the lab where Professor Bray developed this method. So it was kind of interesting, but you know, it's really some of those acidic soils, right? Those Midwest Illinois soils tend to be really in that range of 6.5, right? They won't have the high pH we do see. You know, the Haney test is a little bit different approach, looking at weak organic extractants, again, just different. The Melic-3 really was developed to try to be universal extractant. So we are using Melic for phosphorus, for potassium. You know, we're starting to look at micronutrients, cations, in what situations maybe Melic can work, and also really for high pH. Okay, and this is what we talked about earlier, and I always like to show this, especially if you go back to this Bray versus Melic. You see the high pH situations. It really make no sense, right? It's kind of completely off the expected relationship that you see here with different methods. You see the high pH soils, especially with calcium carbonate, it's kind of forming a cluster there. So again, it's not something that's very descriptive and showing that relationship. Okay, so that's one of the challenges we see there, and so keep an eye on that. Okay, this touch on the one of the early questions about placement. And this is from Scandia. This average of 17 years so far. This is looking at broadcast, deep band with a strip till, and splitting that phosphorus, 20 pounds with the starter, 20 pounds basically with the deep band application. And again, this is what I was saying earlier. You know, agronomically, if you look at that broadcast and deep band, you know, it's basically the same. No statistical difference. We do see a little bit of a bump here if you are putting different strategies. If you're putting starter combination with deep band or starter combination with broadcast, you see that advantage as well, especially if you have low testing soil. And that is in our recommendation. We usually say, you know, if soil testing is low, ideally you want to be putting phosphorus combination of a little bit with the starter, the rest put it with either broadcast or deep band, because we do see an agronomic advantage here. Okay, and so again, that's one situation. And again, it's not huge, but over time you start to see that advantage there with the split application of it. Soybeans is much less sensitive to that, and that's always been the case for soybean. Soybean is not so much like corn. Soybean tends to be a lot more flexible. If you are, you know, doing band application or broadcasting, it just seems to do a lot, you know, just more flexible, I guess, from that standpoint. Okay, so this is the one that I wanted to get to from the last question. You know, what about rainfall and what about placement? You know, if you're doing something in Manhattan versus Meade County and versus Hoxie, what's going on there? And so this is I did this for that particular reason, and this is really fertilizer placement for wheat. And this 40 pounds of P2O5, and we use triple super phosphate because I didn't want to mess with the nitrogen component here, and so I guess just wanted to make sure it's a phosphorus response. So triple super phosphate was able to get, actually starting to get a little popular again. Some people pushing for triple super again, which is kind of interesting in the fertilizer industry. But what we did here is we basically put, you know, this is your control, no fertilizer, in furrow application with the drill. Essentially what you will do with the air seeder, 40 pounds of P2O5. This is pre-planned broadcast, and this is one that you shouldn't be doing, okay? But I was curious to see what happened there. We put some treatment there as a top dress, okay? And so I think you have a combination of things going on here. One of them is that, you know, you have some of these, and these were all, I think the Salina is the closest east, and then we have mostly west at these 6 locations. And so, your typical wheat growing environment. And so again, in furrow, we have an advantage here. And again, winter wheat also often tends to be more responsive to placement to begin with. That's always the way it is. But again, that broadcast not just a tiny bit lower. And in the case of top dressing, this is exactly what's going to be affected by precipitation. If you are top dressing phosphorus, which again you shouldn't be doing that. You should be putting phosphorus ahead of planting wheat. But I do get these questions sometimes, and I think it happens to us often. You get your soil test results maybe too late, whatever. Didn't have time to put any phosphorus. Is there any value in putting that phosphorus as a top dress? So that's a little bit of the question here. And there's a little bit of value, but it's not that different from the control. Okay. So that wheat crop, seeing a little bit of that phosphorus, but not as much. And a lot of these, again, will depend on that question that you asked earlier about precipitation. How much of this is, if we get good rains and dissolving that phosphorus and maybe moving just a little bit, obviously that magnitude of response is going to be better, right? As opposed to a dry situation where, sometimes you have even nitrogen just sitting there, not doing anything. Last year, we saw quite a few situations like that in some cases, right? And so that's always going to be a key factor for mobile nutrients, for sure. But in mobile nutrients, there's also going to be an effect there of precipitation. Okay, and so yes,
on pH on wheat, and we are beginning to see the stratification of low pH, 4.5, 4.9, 5.2. Does this still hold true with 40 pounds versus 80 pounds and things like that?
That's a very good question. And this is kind of a new problem for you guys there, I guess. I mean, traditionally that's a situation that we tend to see more South Central, but you're exactly right. We're starting to see that low pH stratification happening. And we do set one study there. One of the questions is, what about broadcast application to kind of deal with that issue, surface application of lime, and that tends to be sufficient for the most part. Now, one thing that I worry about a little bit here is what your question about phosphorus, because, if we are putting in furrow, of course, it's going to be a lot better with those low pH situations. But remember what I said earlier, you basically kind of liming with phosphorus in that case, because you're getting the advantage of the phosphorus, but you're also getting the advantage of that phosphorus tying up some of the aluminum problems. Okay, so that's one thing that you kind of have to keep in mind. So we do see a better advantage of in-furrow application when you have those low pH situations, right? But again, in the long term, we really need to deal with that low pH. I mean, that's really something that we need to keep in mind. Was there other question there?
Just a bit of a comment on that. The whole deal with thought and dealing with the pH issue, you have to understand part of what's driven that in South Central Kansas for years and years and years. Like the people have tried using them for a pot, basically. And it's a landlord relations thing more than just an agronomic thing. On the sharecrop deal, on their sharecrop arrangements, they could get the landlord to share on cost and share in lining. And so what guys did is they just kept putting on more costs. So you got some fields down there that have ridiculous soils that have feed limits, because they're using it as an effective lining because the landlord pay for the line. So when you hear about how things are managed in South Central Kansas, keep in mind that not all that is for agronomic purpose. A lot of that's involved due to tenant landlord relationships.
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. That's a key. That's a key there, and I was never really supportive of that, because those are short-term things that you're trying to fix, and And what happened is that oftentimes when you have high fertilizer prices, people don't do that kind of applications, and you start to see all kinds of issues show up. And so again, that's really, we shouldn't be doing that unless there are other reasons, like again, land tenure and that.
Okay,
That kind of-
So along those lines, we've had this conversation, I can't remember, if we think about our soil chemistry and our soil types up here are. One time I thought in my mind with our soil types, we were probably at less risk for aluminum toxicity than they are in South Central Kansas, even at the same pH because of different soil types, correct?
Correct. That's a very good point. And one thing, and that what we saw is that the difference. One key factor there is organic matter. So when we're seeing this stratification of pH with low pH developing on top, typically it's in no-till systems where the organic matter content is much higher. And so when you have high organic matter, the aluminum, the aluminum in solution tends to be lower. Why? Because you have some of that CEC of the organic matter helping out. Okay, so that's a key factor there. So that's an interesting situation there.
When you're soil testing, 8-inch versus 6 or 4-inch for your pH test on no-till.
Yeah, in no-till, for no-till, when lime is going to be applied, ideally we want to have a 3-inch sample to make that recommendation. That would be the most accurate approach. Typically, what I would say is, start with your 6-inch sample as regular, right? And if you see a problem of pH, then ideally we want to go back and collect a 3-inch to have a better number for the lime rate, okay? So this is really going to be targeting lime rate options, because again, in no-till, you're not going to be incorporating that lime. And so we are really not, liming the full 6 inches. We're really liming the upper 3 inches only.
okay, Dorgo, I knew you started late, so do you have about 10 more minutes? Would that finish you up or not?
I think so, and we can stop here also here in a.
No, that's okay.
I have a few more things here on phosphorus, and we can finish here. One thing that and I'm not showing the data now, but we did a study looking at how high we can go basically with fertilizer rates for winter wheat, for in-furrow winter wheat, and if the main limiting factor here is to still apply this rate of nitrogen content, right? And so if you're using something like MAP 1152-0, in a 7.5-inch row spacing, you can put quite a bit of that fertilizer with a seed without causing any problems. Okay, and so I think this is important because again, we just saw earlier, there's some advantage here for application of winter wheat. Earlier on the question was, what about broadcast on the surface versus incorporating? Well, this is one way to kind of incorporating that phosphorus, right? Putting all of that in the case of winter wheat, and we can put pretty high rates, which means we can put enough for maybe 2 crops in the rotation at least. And again, that way we're not leaving that phosphorus on the surface. So again, we've done some studies there, actually all the way to 120 pounds of P2O5 without any issues in winter wheat. So again, that's one advantage there. The main issue typically is, with corn, sorghum, soybean, obviously a lot more sensitive. Okay, sources, and this is just to, we'll often get this question: is a liquid 1034O better than MAP or DAP or MES or what? And this is just an example. This is some of these also, I guess, different locations here, but really no difference between sources. Okay, one of the advantage of things like MES or 40 Rock is that we are also putting sulfur, which again it is important. Okay, so I'll stop there, Sandra, since we have a couple other presentations, but I do have some things on sulfur here that I don't know if there's any specific questions. I think I'd rather leave for some questions. And I hear Lucas is there, so if anything else, I want to make sure we have some time for any other questions or discussion.
Questions? I know you've been asking questions as you go.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. If not, then I'll stop there, Sandra. Then and I'll stay online for any other discussions or comments, and I'll be glad to comment.